So friends, Donald Trump just can't quit Letitia James, can he? But you know what? He also can't successfully indict her. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, first, Donald Trump sent his flunky, Lindsey Halligan, into the grand jury to indict New York Attorney General Letitia James, and that indictment got dismissed. So then Trump sent another flunky into the grand jury to try to indict her again, and the grand jury, sitting as the conscience of the community, said, "Oh, hell no." And let's be clear about one thing. If Donald Trump tries a third time, it will not be a charm. Let's start with the new reporting. This from Politico. Grand jury rejects new indictment for Letitia James. The Justice Department can try a third time. A federal grand jury turned down the Trump administration's latest bid to indict New York Attorney General Letitia James, according to two people familiar with the matter who were granted anonymity to discuss the proceedings. A grand jury in Virginia declined to indict James on Thursday, the latest black eye for the administration's campaign to deliver the criminal cases President Donald Trump has demanded against his political adversaries. It's the second time in recent weeks that the case against James for allegedly falsifying mortgage paperwork related to property in the Norfolk, Virginia area has flamed out. Last month, U.S. District Judge Cameron Curry threw out the case against James, along with separate charges against former FBI Director James Comey, after concluding that the lead prosecutor, Lindsey Halligan, handpicked by Trump to bring both cases, had been illegally appointed. The Justice Department could make a third attempt to indict James. This from James' lawyer. Quote, "The grand jury's refusal to re-indict Attorney General James is a decisive rejection of a case that should never have existed in the first place," James' lead defense attorney, Abby Lowell, said in a statement. Quote, "A federal court threw this case out after President Trump illegally installed a U.S. attorney to file baseless charges against Attorney General James that career prosecutors refused to bring. This should be the end of the case," Lowell added. "If they continue undeterred by a court ruling and a grand jury's rejection of the charges, it will be a shocking assault on the rule of law and a devastating blow to the integrity of our justice system." And friends, here's just a little bit of additional reporting, this from the New York Times, about how this second grand jury presentation played out. Roger Keller, a federal prosecutor brought in from Missouri to handle the case after career lawyers determined the evidence was too weak to support charges, presented a new version of the indictment on Thursday, according to two people familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe events intended to be kept private. Okay, friends, now, before we turn to a few main takeaways, I have a question. What changed? What changed between the first grand jury presentation by Lindsey Halligan, former insurance lawyer with no criminal law experience, Lindsey Halligan, former repeat beauty pageant contestant? Guess what, Lindsey? Ain't no swimsuit competition in the grand jury. What changed between the first grand jury, where Lindsey Halligan walked in, did Lord knows what, and walked out with an indictment against Letitia James, and the second grand jury, where a federal prosecutor, they had to go all the way to Missouri to find, because no experienced federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office would bring a baseless, evidence-free, vindictive prosecution against Letitia James. So they had to get this guy, Roger Keller, to walk into that second grand jury, present the evidence to that second grand jury, and that grand jury said, "Oh, hell no, you don't have it." What changed? How did Lindsey Halligan manage to get the grand jurors to vote in favor of indicting Letitia James in that first grand jury, but an actual career prosecutor, Roger Keller, presumably with the same evidence, couldn't get the second grand jury to indict Letitia James? What changed? Well, guess what? If they go back in a third time, which almost never happens, and they manage to come out that third time with an indictment, then we're going to need to see everything that went on in the first grand jury and the second grand jury and the third grand jury, because now we're going to move to the takeaways. This case against Letitia James is dead, even if Donald Trump's dirty DOJ leadership doesn't know it yet. Why? Because Letitia James will have such a strong, robust, compelling, vindictive prosecution claim and selective prosecution claim that if they actually go back in a third time and walk out with an indictment, it will be dismissed, just like the prior Lindsey Halligan obtained indictment was. It will be dismissed, in my opinion. Let's talk about some more takeaways. The Department of Justice, my former professional home for decades, I spent more hours before grand juries than I can ever count. DOJ doesn't go in 3 times and try to indict somebody and fail over and over again. It is unheard of, except in the age of Trump, of course, because remember, D.C. U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro sent her people in 3 times, and the grand jury said no, no, no 3 times. So, of course, Jeanine Pirro then fumbles forward and brings low-level misdemeanor charges, which don't require a grand jury indictment. Only felony charges do, and they can't even win a conviction on those reduced charges when they proceed to trial. So, yes, I guess in fairness, in the age of Trump, there is this rampant abuse of the grand jury process that never works out well for Trump or his dirty DOJ leadership. But at least in my experience, in the decades I was at the Department of Justice, it was unheard of to present a case 3 times. Not unlawful, but unheard of. Why is it that we always hear prosecutors can indict a ham sandwich? Well, first of all, I think that's an unfair characterization. If the prosecutor is honest and ethical, bound by the facts and the law and the ethics of our practice, they can't indict a ham sandwich unless, of course, the ham sandwich was caught committing a crime. So the reason people say it's so easy for a prosecutor to win an indictment in the grand jury, indict a ham sandwich, is because it is a one-sided presentation before the grand jury. The only people allowed in that private, windowless room, the grand jury room, the only people in there are the prosecutor, the grand jurors, and we're going to talk about them in a minute, a court reporter, a grand jury reporter taking down and recording, audio recording every word that's uttered in there, and a witness. If I, the prosecutor, am presenting a witness to the grand jury, I can't even bring in an FBI agent or a homicide detective or any law enforcement member, while the witness is testifying. So there's no judge in the grand jury calling balls and strikes with respect to what questions a prosecutor can ask a witness or what evidence a prosecutor can present. And the rules of evidence are almost non-existent, very, very, very lax before the grand jury. There's no defense attorney cross-examining the witness that the prosecutor is presenting, testing it in the crucible of cross-examination, which has been described as, the best engine for discovering the truth known to man. Cross-examination, none of that. It's an entirely one-sided affair, which, leads to the overwhelming majority of the cases being indicted. And even beyond all that, friends, the burden of proof, the evidence required for a grand jury to vote in favor of an indictment is extremely low. It is simply probable cause. Probable cause that a crime has been committed and the person the prosecutor is seeking to indict committed it. Probable cause is down here. Once you get to trial, proof beyond a reasonable doubt is way up here. And if the prosecutors in this second grand jury couldn't even satisfy the grand jurors that there was probable cause to believe Letitia James committed a crime, ain't no way in hell they're going to convince a trial jury of proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Letitia James committed a crime. That's another reason this case is already dead and stinking. Also, in the grand jury, a decision to indict somebody doesn't have to be unanimous. Let's talk about the numbers. Grand juries consist of 23 people, at most, 23 citizens who have been summoned to do grand jury service by the court. And of those 23 people, there have to be at least 16 in the room, in the grand jury room. That represents a quorum, 16 in order for the grand jury to be open and do business. Have prosecutors address the grand jury, have witnesses appear before the grand jury, have evidence presented to the grand jury. There has to be 16, but there can be as many as 23. That cushion is built in there because I can tell you, based on experience, every grand juror doesn't show up for every grand jury every day. We've got some cushion there. We need at least 16. Now, when you ask the grand jury to vote on an indictment, of those at least 16 people who have to be in the room, can be 20, can be 23, but at least 16, only 12 have to vote in favor of an indictment. So it doesn't have to be a unanimous verdict on whether to indict someone. So if you're at trial, it needs to be unanimous. All 12 people sitting in that wooden jury box need to vote unanimously to convict somebody in order to return a conviction. But in the grand jury, it doesn't have to be unanimous. However, if you only get 11 people vote in favor of an indictment, or 10, or anything less than 12, that's a no bill. That's the grand jury saying, hell no, we won't indict. And that is just what they told Roger Keller when he went back in there and tried to secure a second indictment against Letitia James. And as I say, friends, the third time, if they try it, it will not be a charm, because what that does is it gives Letitia James and her attorneys more ammunition to go back into court and say, if ever there was a vindictive prosecution that ought to be dismissed, it is this one. And that, in my opinion, will be a winning motion to dismiss in the event Trump's dirty DOJ leadership goes back in and tries for a third time to indict Letitia James. It will be a winning motion to dismiss. And you know why? You know why. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.